tonight we're going to be discussing redemption deeds here for a minute. Now, redemption deeds are something we do talk about on a regular basis, and honestly, when we first started, I really kind of looked down on redemption deeds, especially now that I kind of look back and I realize that I really snubbed my nose at them. But there are a lot of opportunities with redemption deeds. Now, they are essentially tax deeds that are sold with a redemption period that are attached to them. But there's more to it than just that. There are different rules that can change things and make things advantageous for investors. Also, the price the properties sell for can change a bit because there is a time period attached to the property after purchase where you may not be able to sell it. So if you've got to wait for 6 months, that brings down the price from what it would if you could just turn around and sell the property immediately. So that can also create good opportunities. But yeah, essentially we call them kind of a hybrid between the two because they're essentially tax deeds that are treated a little bit like liens. They have the ability to redeem, which also means there has to be a penalty rate or some kind of a rate of return if it does happen to redeem. And so, and there's actually more states that use redemption deeds than I originally thought. It's kind of a bigger category. But some of the more familiar states are states like Georgia and Texas, and well, thinking about a few others here. Well, I'm sure we'll be talking about some of them here tonight. But the thing about redemption periods for redemption deeds is they tend to be shorter than the redemption periods for liens. So they'll start as short as 2 months, and about the longest you'll find is 3 years. 2 years for homestead properties there in Texas, 6 months for most properties there. It's 1 year for Georgia and their properties. But again, any area that has a redemption period is also going to have either an interest rate return or a flat rate, a penalty that will be paid out if the property happens to redeem. So if redemption occurs, you should make a pretty good flat rate, of return on your money. That ranges between different states, but it should be at least 10 to 12% or more. And one thing that's also unique about redemption deed states is Texas is the only state that does this, but they extend ownership rights during the redemption period, which is kind of weird. It means, you go to the auction, you buy the property at auction, and they actually give you the power to take possession of the property. You just can't sell it immediately. So you can take immediate possession of the property after the sale. You just don't have the power to sell it immediately. So, that's one thing that only Texas does. Nobody else has anything like that.
Yeah, well, when we're talking about redemption deeds, they're not created equally. There's going to be differences between the different redemption deed states, and so we've kind of categorized all of these different type of properties where you're essentially getting some type of deed or you have a higher percentage of ownership. Usually you're going to use some type of premium bid method. So when we're talking about the difference between a tax lien certificate, well, tax liens you're usually going to earn just an interest rate return. So if it was an 18% return, you would essentially win a percent or earn 1.5% per month. So if it redeemed after 6 months, you would earn a 9% return. They're not going to give you any type of ownership rights, which some of these states like Texas that Shay just explained will, where you'll have ownership right during that redemption period. But the biggest difference is that most tax lien certificates are going to redeem before going through the foreclosure process. Over 95% of tax liens redeem. That means that only 5% of those end up in property ownership. Because of it, with tax lien certificates, we're usually going to need to do less research than we would with a redemption deed. When we're talking about redemption deeds, some of these states are going to offer a penalty, like Texas or Georgia, where it doesn't matter when it redeems, you're going to go ahead and make that flat fee. Others will offer an interest rate. But one of the key aspects of redemption deeds is we're going to need to do more research because we're going to have a lot higher chance of ownership. In fact, in some of these states where it's got a 60-day redemption period, or even in Texas where it has a 6-month redemption period, a lot of times that may be already a couple of months in before the auction. So we're going to have a lot higher chance of actually acquiring those properties with the redemption deed, which means that we're going to need to research those properties more before actually bidding on them and participating in the auction.
Yeah, essentially, we have to research them just like tax deeds, but also understanding some of the other aspects that go into redemption deeds, like the redemption period. Now, uh, redemption deeds are generally sold by premium bid, just highest bidder wins, but the opening bid is usually the combined total for uh, all the taxes that were owed while it was basically building up. So it's usually 1 to 2 years worth of taxes, that are combined and included in that, depending on the area that you are, that you're at. But what also can change is when exactly you are recorded on the deed after you win. So basically the property's bid up in price. If you're the high bidder, you win. But in some cases, they're not going to record your name just yet because you still have to wait the redemption period. And if they recorded your name, it would basically transfer ownership of the property, and you could turn around. So what they do is it's like they have you mostly recorded, but you're just not quite submitted yet. And they're not going to do that until the redemption period expires. And so uh, it helps to become familiar with some of these areas and how they work, so that you can become more familiar with protocols and steps that you can take here with properties like this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's one of the advantages of being a member and having access to the different state guides, whether that be through your home study program or through the state guides online, is it gives you the ability to review exactly how that state is and maybe say, actually, this is too long a redemption period here. I'm more interested in Connecticut, for example, that has a shorter redemption period. In fact, we're actually going to review a Connecticut auction coming up here in the pre-sale review. But to kind of give you an idea of how this works is most of these are going to have a premium bid method. In fact, Louisiana was the last holdout, which was using an old form of bidding called bid down the ownership, and they're moving over to a premium bid method, which means that let's say the property starts at a $10,000 opening bid and it ends up selling for $20,000, the investor will go ahead and pay that $20,000, and that additional $10,000 is what's called the overbid. In fact, if you've heard of overages or excess proceeds, that's kind of where that comes from. So when we're talking about redemption deeds, we're not going to be bidding down the interest rate or anything like that. We're going to be bidding up the price of the property, which makes it closer to a tax deed. In fact, like Shade mentioned, a lot of these properties are going to be recorded in your name, or they'll go ahead and create the deed and not record it until after the redemption period is passed. But we need to research and bid on these properties like we're going to be the owner. Because in some cases, I think you've got and this is just my guess from experience, but a 70% chance in some of these auctions to actually acquire the property. So based on that, we're going to need to go ahead and do our research. And worst case scenario, we're going to make a great interest rate return on our money because most of these are going to have a pretty good return. But we're still going to go through stage 1, 2, and 3 due diligence, especially if it's going to have a shorter redemption period. We're going to still get on-site evaluations if we're going to acquire the property in 60 days.
One thing that's kind of interesting about redemption deed states as well is that once the owner has lost the property, to the auction and it's in the redemption period, it tends to be very difficult for them to redeem the property once in that redemption period, because it's not like just redeeming a lien. They have their original bill, which is now bigger because it went to auction, plus, whatever the penalty is going to have to be. So it kind of balloons up to a fairly large amount that makes it even more difficult for people to pay, which increases the chances, that it results in just ownership, and that, it doesn't end up paying off, last minute. It's essentially why you always have to bid on these things like you are just bidding on tax deed properties, because like Steve was saying, you've got probably a 50-50 shot of owning any particular redemption deed you bid on.
Yeah, in fact, we were looking over some properties that sold in Texas last night with our coaching students. We couldn't believe how many good deals are picked up in some of these redemption deed auctions. Now, as far as the penalties, some are going to be penalty states and some are going to be interest rate states. Now, how the penalties work is it doesn't matter when the property owner redeems within that redemption period, you're going to make a full flat penalty rate. So in Texas, in Georgia, there's a number of other states as well. where it doesn't matter if it redeems the very next day. You purchase the property on a Tuesday, they come in on Wednesday, you're still going to make 25% of the return on your money in Texas, or 20% in Georgia. So it's not like an interest rate return where it's going to be spread out. You're going to make that full penalty rate, which makes it a pretty good investment. Either you're going to get the property, and in some cases you're going to have a higher chance. Now in a state like Tennessee, maybe it's a 50-50 shot, or maybe even a little bit less than that, but we're still going to have a lot higher chance of getting those properties. When it comes to the redemption periods, usually, like Shade mentioned, they're going to be quite a bit less. Most of the redemption deeds are going to be 1 year or less.
Yeah, in fact, some of them are quite a bit less than that. But we talked a little bit about Texas. We talked a little bit about Georgia. 6 months for Texas, or 2 years if it's homestead or farm land. And in Georgia, we have the 1 year period here. Now, let's talk about some of the other redemption deed states that exist, because we've talked about Georgia and Texas, but we also have Delaware that have a 15% rate they pay, Hawaii at 12, Louisiana at 12, Tennessee at 10. Tennessee is probably like the lowest, but what's interesting about that is there can be good opportunities to buy properties outright because they don't attract as many investors because their rate isn't as high as some of the other states out there. And so there tends to be kind of more opportunities that way. Connecticut at 18% and Rhode Island at 12 to 16%.
Yeah, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we went through and looked at the Delaware auction, and we looked at some properties in one of the last podcasts, and it was interesting to see because there really is good opportunity. Now, some of these counties have moved online. Tennessee has moved online. That's made it pretty pretty desirable, even with that lower interest rate return, because a 10% interest rate is still a pretty good return on most of your investments.